Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. I'm Stephen Burt from NQA, and this afternoon we're going to look at giving your events the green light with ISO 21221. So ISO 21221 is the international standard for event sustainability management systems. I think we'll probably take around about 45 minutes or so this afternoon, which should leave us a few minutes towards the end to hopefully be able to answer any questions which you have. Within your control panel, you'll be able to see the questions box. So feel free to type in any questions into there as we go, or feel free to type in any questions towards the end, and I'll do my best to be able to answer them. So what we're going to look at today is ISO 21221. We'll have a kind of introduction, a brief overview of NQA sustainability services. We'll then look at the background to event sustainability itself, why sustainable development for the events industry is important. And then we'll look at the international standard, ISO 21221 itself as well. And towards the end, we'll have a very quick run through how NQA might be able to support you in achieving certification to the standard. And as I said, we'll have time for some questions and answers towards the end, I think. So firstly, NQA, we are a global certification body and verification body operating under our various global accreditations to deliver various different services, primarily relating to ISO management system certification and verification services. So ISO 21221, the event sustainability management system standard, is only one of many ISO standards which we provide services for, but my role in NQA is the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director. So I look after our greenhouse gas management verification services, some wider sustainability standards like the one that we're looking at today for event sustainability management systems, as well as others like, ISO 26000, which is social responsibility standards. So we're a global operation headquartered here in the UK, the US, India, China, and the UK are by far our biggest markets, although we've got quite a strong presence throughout the EU and some other bits and pieces, other countries in the world as well. So I've been with NQA for a good 15 years or so, but overall I've had about 25 years, over 25 years experience in carbon and energy and environmental management ever since coming out of university. I've also got extensive events management experience as well, and I'm also a lead auditor myself for ISO 21221 for the event sustainability side of things. So I've got good experience of conducting audits in the event industry against that particular standard. So yeah, that's my role, that's my background within NQA as well. So just to start with some fun facts to try and sort of set the context around event sustainability and why ISO 21221 was developed. So according to the UK events report from 2024, basically the event industry for the UK economy is a really significant contributor to the wealth of the nation. So in 2023, the events industry was valued at around about over 60 billion pounds going into the UK economy. And that comes from a variety of sources, including delegates coming to the events themselves and the amount of money that they spend and contribute to the economy. The average inbound visitor for events spends a lot more than, the inbound visitor for events spends a lot more than the average inbound visitor into the UK, significantly more in fact, and that's on obviously business and leisure side of things. Interestingly, the three top venues for within the UK for events are London, Edinburgh and Glasgow, so quite a strong Scottish presence there. I live in Edinburgh, and there's always events going on in this city all through the year, as well as the very, very large summer time events as well. And global planners for events, their priorities according to the report are firstly cost and value, as you would expect. Secondly, safety and security, kind of as you would expect. But interestingly, thirdly, equity and diversity are most important for planners globally. So that kind of helps to put how important sustainable development for events are into context. And sustainability and social impact for venues themselves is becoming a much greater priority as well. So overall, the events industry, it really has a very significant positive economic impact on the countries which host those events, but we need to also think about the negative impact. So ISO 21221 uses the three sort of terms or categories for sustainable development, which are economic, social, and environmental considerations. So we'll just quickly work through those one by one and have a think about how events relate to each of those. So looking at the environmental side of things, a French 2019 research study of all the events which took place in France concluded that on average, a 3-day, 800-person conference will have a carbon footprint of around about 455 tons of carbon dioxide. Putting that in context, my own organisation, NQA UK in Ireland, our carbon footprint for everything which we did in 2023 was 367 tons. So it kind of just suggests that, a single large conference, international conference event in carbon terms can actually be much greater than an entire year's worth of NQA's activity in the UK and Ireland. We're a service-based organisation, of course. Our carbon footprint's never going to be huge, but we do, well over 1 million miles per year in our fleet, for example. We have offices, we have lots of home workers, lots of commuters and that type of thing. So the events themselves do have a significant carbon footprint, and that can be made up primarily of delegate travel. If you're having an international event, delegates have to travel to and from the event itself, which has a high carbon footprint. Freight, so moving stands and AV equipment to and from venues is a significant contributor. Food is a huge contributor, as we'll see in a second, and including food waste as well. The electrics for electricity consumption for space design and production, heating, accommodation, all of these issues have significant contribution towards the carbon footprint of events. And a personal gripe of mine is the merchandise and the freebies side of things that you see at some events. So it's a huge industry worldwide, and I'm sure we've all got sitting on our desk various bits and pieces that we've picked up at various events, which perhaps we don't use very often or perhaps don't have a very long life. But merchandise and freebies on stands is also a significant contributor to the carbon footprint of events. And this is just a nice little graph from the French study of the French events industry, and it just shows this is including travel and accommodation, where the major carbon impacts across various events comes from. As you would expect, it's primarily travel for all of them, although food, which is the kind of lighter blue column there, food and drink is a significant contributor to the carbon footprint of events as well. And if we then remove travel and accommodation, we can really see how the space design and production element of the event becomes a much larger factor in the overall carbon footprint. And we can also see that with food as well. The food and drink service is a significant contributor in terms of carbon overall. other examples of environmental issues to think about with sustainable events. These are taken straight from ISO 21221 itself. It talks about biodiversity, it talks about hazardous chemicals, sourcing, packaging, minimization of food waste, the choice of materials, and that could include merchandise as well, local noise issues, pollution incidents, and so on. So those are various issues pulled from the standard directly. And then in terms of social impacts of events, or social considerations rather of events, again, these are taken directly from the international standard ISO 21221, and we need to think about things like accessibility, consumer delegate choices, discrimination, vulnerable groups as well. Health and safety is a very important social aspect of the events industry. It was a few years ago, the Health and Safety Executive had a real strong focus on the events industry because people are working at height, people are working with electrics, people are manual handling, there's lots of vehicles moving around and so on. So health and safety is an important consideration within the social element of the sustainable development of the event. Human rights, illegal drugs, international labour law considerations as well. Security is a very important aspect. We saw that that was the second most important thing to global planners for events. So we always think about the security policies and processes when we consider the social impacts. As well as the suppliers which are used, the venues, the suppliers of products and services, and the sustainability criteria within those businesses is important as well. And then from an economic perspective, not so much a great problem in the UK, but we do have international events where things like corruption and anti-competitive behaviour can be an issue, as can certain contractual practices as well. We have the positive impact of economic value generated and distributed, of course, and there's various indirect economic impacts, including employment opportunities, development of infrastructure for things like sporting events like the Olympic Games, the World Cup, and so on. There's lots of different economic issues to think about when considering sustainability of events. So that's just kind of setting the context around the events management industry and how sustainable development might apply to it. Let's have a look at ISO 21221 itself next. So this is what it looks like. It was first published in 2012, which is the version on the left-hand side of the screen, and more recently in 2024 is the current version, which is an example on the right-hand side of the screen. So that's what it looks like. It is a document which you can purchase directly from ISO themselves. The changes made from the old 2012 version to the new 2024 versions are relatively insignificant overall. There's no major changes were made. It was more around clarifications on certain items like climate change considerations, policy wording changes. It gives us some additional information, which is really useful actually. That for an ISO standard, the guidance that's provided in this document is excellent. So there's a nice table which helps us to do things like identify interested parties and identify the major sustainable development issues. There was the addition of a new clause focused on change management and the planning of changes. And there was a real strengthening of the requirements around supply chain engagement and the need for supply chain control. So ISO 21221 focuses very heavily on the supply chain for the event itself, and encouraging and assisting the supply chain in terms of sustainable development overall. So the purpose of the standard, it's obviously a framework for improving the sustainability of events. It's applicable for organisations of all types and sizes. It's structured as many ISO standards are these days around a particular structure which they call Annex SL. And the reason that that's beneficial is because it makes it easier to integrate the ISO 21221 requirements into other ISO management system requirements, like, for example, ISO 9001 quality or ISO 14001 environmental management system standards. So it's very easily integrated. If you've already got ISO certificates on your wall, then that goes quite a long way actually towards the requirements for ISO 21221. It's important to stress that an event alone cannot claim conformance to the standard. It's the standard is intended to cover the management system for the event or for the events. So you can't claim that one particular event is compliant with ISO 21221. What you can claim is that the organisation has a management system in place which is conformant with the standard itself. It covers claims of conformity, in other words, how you can go about making claims that you are certified to ISO 21221. And as I mentioned, it focuses in on what it calls governing principles, and it tries to split those out into environmental, social, and economic issues. So just an example of some of the events. Some of these are NQA clients, others aren't. But these are the kind of organisations who are certified to ISO 21221. So there's a very strong focus on sporting events there. I was recently at Silverstone for ISO 21221. I'm going to the Golf Open as well to do an audit this year for ISO 21221, and I was recently at an event being run by Porsche down in London where they were operating that event to ISO 21221 as well. So there's a real range of different organisations who would be interested in this particular standard, from venues to event management companies to international organisations. And just a quick example of how to do a sustainable event. So this is the band Coldplay. When they go on tour, they always report after the gigs themselves on the performance of the events in terms of the various sustainable development issues that they are interested in. So carbon dioxide emissions obviously is an important one. They do tree planting activities, they do ocean cleanup and river cleanup activities. They think about the waste and the return and the reuse of things like wristbands that they issue. They try to use renewable electricity generation for the venues, and they try to use battery systems to provide power for the shows themselves. They try to use low carbon transport to get their equipment around the world. And they monitor things like, the overall power consumption per show, the carbon dioxide saved. They make contributions to things like food banks for the food waste, toiletries as well, and they provide various financial support to various organisations who are focused on sustainable development. So if you're interested to see what a sustainable event looks like, a Coldplay gig is quite a good place to start overall. And the best thing about it is that they report transparently on the elements of the event, of the gigs themselves. So some of the benefits of implementing ISO 21221 There is, the ability to integrate it into other management system standards easily because of the Annex SL side of things. There's also the opportunity for cost savings. So just looking back at the Coldplay gigs there, much reduced energy consumption, much reduced waste production. All of those things cost money. So there is the opportunity for cost savings by running events more sustainability. The idea of transparency and risk mitigation along with continual improvement are all key as well, and meeting stakeholder expectations. So delegates, event organisers often have significant expectations around event sustainability for the events that they go to, and all of that helps with brand enhancement as well. So lots of venues these days, including some football grounds that we work with, are certified to ISO 21221, and it's all part of, amongst other things, the brand enhancement for the organisation that's running and hosting the events. So it covers not only event organisers, but also the supply chain, the stakeholders, but there's lots of organisations and stakeholders who can benefit from the application of ISO 21221. So obviously the event organisers and owners themselves. The workforce is an important consideration. So some of the events that I've been to have seen some really impressive things around making sure that the workforce are safe, making sure they're fed, making sure that they have the accessibility needs that they require. So the efficient running of it with a content workforce is an important part of it. The supply chain, as I mentioned, is a big focus. So caterers, stand constructors, transport companies. We shouldn't forget about the participants either. So the delegates that come to the events can benefit from a more proactive approach to sustainable development. And also the communities themselves that are in the areas which host the events. There's employment opportunities, there's opportunities to minimise nuisance like noise, for example. So there's lots of different stakeholders who can benefit from ISO 21221. And in practice, what it means around events, it may include, making sure that you're in compliance with legal and other requirements. So these differ significantly around the world, depending on where the event's been held. There's lots of considerations around things like unionised workforce. There's lots of considerations around things like food safety, accessibility as well. The laws on that differ significantly around the world, as does things like health and safety, gender pay gaps, protected characteristics. So the identification of the legal requirements and the need to plan for those is an important consideration. Health and safety controls we've mentioned, stands have to be erected, there's rigging works that go on, things have to be moved around, powered access equipment and so on. That's all very important, as are the social and governance controls, and also the communications with suppliers and delegates. So I've seen myself at events doing audits, and the communications around the event itself on what they're doing to trying to improve the sustainability have always taken me by surprise, nice surprise. And even things like, information in the lifts at the event and the lifts in the accommodation in the hotels. I've even seen information on the sustainable development criteria for the event posted in lifts at the venue and in the accommodation. So other things that you could think about, the caterers, where does the food come from? So I did a audit in a big international event in Glasgow not so long ago, and they'd done some great things, like the food that they were serving was all sourced from within, I think it was 30 or 40 miles or something like that from the venue. Even the flowers on the table, they didn't have flowers on the table, they had heather and thistles, I think it was, on the table that on the tables that they'd taken from local sources in and around Glasgow. Food waste is an important consideration. Food waste releases a lot of methane as it breaks down, and methane is a very, very powerful global warming gas. And also food bank donations. So another event which I did an audit in the United States, they actually got the delegates from the event to volunteer to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning on day 2 and help to pack up all the excess food. And then a charity came along and collected the food and took it away for donations to food banks. So they were getting the delegates involved in doing that side of things. The venues within the supply chain, obviously location's important in terms of travel. Energy consumption and whether they have a renewable energy supply is important. Transport links are important as well. The materials that are used, so I've been to events where they've just stopped using floor coverings, they've stopped using carpets because it's such a tricky thing to get rid of. Generally they lay carpets for the event, lift them afterwards and throw them away. So there's been some good progress in recent years with recycled and recyclable carpets, and there's been even greater progress in just not using the carpets in the first place for the events. I was also at an event down in London doing an audit where they had a prize for the most sustainable stand in the exhibition, and one of the exhibitors had brought a stand along that was made entirely from recycled cardboard. And it stood up and stayed stood up for the 3 days that the event was there. It didn't, well, maybe looked a little bit kind of worn, but towards the end of it. But the point is that they won the award for the most sustainable stand. It did its job, and there was no vinyl in use. There was no plastic in use. It was all recycled cardboard that then went off to be reused at the end, and anything that couldn't be reused could go and be recycled. Transport's important, delegate travel, lighter materials as well for stand shells, going back to the cardboard example we mentioned there. The selection of the hotels for accommodation is important, and the waste management contractor and their ability, you know, out the back of every venue is a great big compound full of skips. Segregating the waste, minimising the waste in the first place, and getting reports from the waste management contractor about what happens to that waste are all key things to consider. And merchandise we've mentioned or not. Sourcing merchandise is an important thing. So the big event that I was in Glasgow just simply chose not to have any merchandise on any of the exhibition stands at all. And I don't think anybody missed not going home with an extra water bottle or a USB stick or whatever it might be. But merchandising is a big issue overall in terms of sustainability. And health and safety, security, we've already mentioned. Both of those are important issues. So ISO 21221 itself, what does it look like? So this diagram's taken directly from the standard. It follows a nice logical process, or certainly to my mind, it follows a nice logical process where when you're designing the system, you have to work out you know, who the stakeholders are, who are the interested parties, what scope does the management system cover, how are we going to apply governing principles of sustainable development to the events management system, writing a policy, assigning roles and responsibilities for the management system itself. One of the key elements in ISO 21221 is the identification and evaluation of sustainable development issues. So I'll speak about that a little more in a second, but that's one of the key things to be thinking about and be aware of. Making sure that the teams that are running the event are sufficient in terms of resource and that they've been trained, they're competent to do what they're doing. Managing the internal and external communications around the event, making sure that you document and record everything that goes on, and managing the supply chain. So I'll expand on that one a little bit more as well. Clause 6 and Clause 8 really are the two really unique clauses, if you like, to ISO 21221. And then there's a continual improvement loop involving internal audits and management review and taking any necessary corrective action that's needed. So this is how the standard is organised. It's got 10 clauses overall. We don't have to worry too much about clauses 1, 2 and 3. That's just the scope of the standard. Clause 2 is what's called normative references. In other words, mandatory references it makes to other documents that have to be considered, but there's none in this case. And Clause 3 just gives us some useful terms and definitions around event sustainability. Clause 4 is about the context of the organisation. So for those of you who are familiar with other ISO standards, you will be familiar with that terminology. But this is about identifying risks and opportunities for the events, identifying the interested parties for the events, and then building sustainable development principles and a mission statement around those particular issues. Fortunately, I said with ISO 21221, it's particularly great at providing us with guidance that we need to help us to implement the system. So in the back of it, in Annex A, there's two useful sources of information. There's table A1, which gives us a list of interested parties for us to use to identify our own interested parties, and table A2 provides us with governing principles of sustainable development relating to event management. And both of those documents, or both of those tables in the appendix are really useful for helping to meet the requirements of Clause 4. Clause 5 is about leadership. When I do audits, I will do my very best to find 15, 20, 30 minutes with the managing director of the events management company or the managing director of the venue, and I'll try and get the chance to sit down with them and talk through leadership and commitment requirements. There is a requirement to establish a policy document, a sustainable development policy, which is common in many ISO standards, and also to define roles, responsibilities and authorities. So that's the leadership clause. Clause 6 is the planning clause. So this is about taking actions to address risks and opportunities. So one of the key things in this clause is about identifying what are the sustainable development issues. And ISO 21221 being the extremely useful standard that it is in terms of guidance, it gives us a nice table C1, which is a list of issues for organizations to consider in fulfilling issue identification and evaluation. And I like to think of this in my head. If any of you are familiar with ISO 14001, environmental management systems, the process in ISO 14001 for identifying your environmental aspects and then evaluating them for significance is exactly the same process that you're being asked to do here. This time you're being asked to identify your sustainable development issues that relate to the events, and then to evaluate them for significance so that you're managing the most significant of the sustainable development issues themselves. Clause 6.1 also asks you to identify and plan for relevant legal and other requirements. And as I mentioned earlier, those differ quite significantly depending on which particular country you're in. So, if you're holding events in different countries, you do need to identify the legal and other requirements related to the events in those particular countries. There's also a clause 6.2 just requiring event sustainability objectives and targets to be set and plans on how you're going to achieve those objectives and targets. Clause 7 is very, very familiar to those of us who've who are involved with other ISO standards. So this is about making sure adequate resources are available, making sure people are competent and aware that have roles and responsibilities within the management system, internal and external communications, and then the management of documented information, document control, record control, that side of things, all very familiar from other ISO management system standards. And then clause 8 is about operational planning and control. So once we know what our legal requirements are, once we know what our significant sustainable development issues are for the event, then we can then work out logically what we need to control in terms of operations. So that might result in procedures. ISO 21221 doesn't say that you'll actually write down procedures or anything like that, but usually the control processes for the delivery of the event itself can incorporate the various sustainable development issues and legal requirements which need to be managed. Clause 8.2 is about managing changes. So if things change as the event progresses or in the lead up to the event, then it's just about how to manage those changes. And clause 8.3, the supply chain clause, this is a real critical one. This is about including sufficient information in tender processes so that you can evaluate your suppliers to help to support the sustainability objectives. So there's a sort of trickle of sustainable development that rolls down from the customer, into your supply chain. So, the caterers, for example, the waste management contractors, for example, the floor managers, gathering risk assessments and liability insurance records for the AV companies or the Shell stand directors, that those kind of suppliers are critical in managing things, and clause 8.3 focuses in on that very strongly. And why is that important, the supply chain? Well, the majority of events are undertaken through, event production activities are undertaken through the supply chain itself, including the workforce. So procurement's a key element, and the ability to issue tenders and award contracts based partly, not entirely, obviously cost and quality is always going to be number 1 and 2 in supplier appointment. But their commitment to and their arrangements for sustainable development should also be weighted factors in the contract award process for suppliers. Clause 9, we all recognise if you're involved with ISO management systems as well. This is about monitoring what you're doing, measuring what you're doing, evaluating what you're doing, conducting internal audits of the event sustainability management system, and having a management review meeting normally once a year or thereabouts to review the performance overall. And the last clause is a continual improvement clause, again very familiar from other ISO management systems. This is just about planning for ongoing continual improvement, and if there are any non-conforming activities that are noted, perhaps through internal audit, then establishing corrective actions to put them right and stop them happening again. So that's a quick whirlwind tour through the requirements of ISO 21221. So how can NQA support you in achieving certification? It's worth mentioning that UCAS, United Kingdom Accreditation Service, who govern everything that NQA and other certification bodies and verification bodies do, UCAS don't offer accreditation for ISO 21221 yet, but NQA do offer it, and we offer it as if it was accredited, which we always do with anything that we offer that accreditation is not available for. So we can conduct audits of your ISO 21221 system, and we can award certificates of conformance for it as well. But with lots of tools online on our sustainability microsite, you can find case studies from event sustainability side of things, webinars. You can find fact sheets and blogs and quick reads around ISO 21221 overall. We also offer various training. So on NQA's training website, you can find training resources relating to ISO 21221 and lots of other things as well. And the certification process with NQA. So step 1 is to complete a quote request form. Step 2 is really us planning to conduct the audits themselves and organising dates for the auditor to come and do the stage 1 audit, we call it, in other words, a documentation review. And then step 3, we will do what's called a stage 2 audit, and the stage 2 audit is about whether the management system's implemented. So I always organise things so we do the stage 1 audit remotely, and then I usually try to split the stage 2 audit into 3, and the first part of that is the pre-event planning processes. So before the event, I'll do a little bit of the audit, then looking at the pre-event planning, and then I'll attend the event and speak to the delegates, speak to the venue, speak to the suppliers, the caterers and so on. I'll watch them doing the rigging and the de-rigging activities and the setup. And then the third part of it is usually post-event. So after the event's taken place, maybe 3 or 4 weeks after, the post-event review of how things have gone and did we achieve what we want to achieve. So I usually try to split it into 3 if at all possible. And then once certification's achieved, the certificates are issued and they're valid for 3 years as per all the other ISO management system services that we offer. So hopefully that gives you a nice introduction to sustainable development for events and gives you an idea of what might be involved. Hopefully it's given you an introduction to ISO 21221 and a look at what's involved in adopting that and the benefits of doing so, and also what's involved in terms of seeking certification to ISO 21221. So that brings us to an end. Thank you very much. I don't think we've got any questions, but if anybody does have any questions, we've got a few minutes and you could type them into the questions box now. So Yuri, thank you very much for your comments. That's very kind, thank you. Matthew Piggott, how you doing? Nice to know you're out there. What's the main pitfall challenge when aligning to the ISO? It's usually the supply chain, Matthew, trying to get your suppliers on board with your principles of sustainable development. Can be quite tricky, but I think the supply chain for events are more and more clued up these days than they've ever been around the various sustainable development issues, particularly energy and carbon and waste, actually. Certainly all the big venues that I've been to, all the big events that I've been to, they've often been doing some really clever stuff around use of renewable energy, generating their own power, doing what they can to minimize the carbon impacts overall, recycling as much waste as possible, avoiding as much waste as possible, and catering companies as well. They're often these days very clued up as well about food sourcing techniques as well. We've got a question, what CO2 GHG calculator event industry uses? For carbon calculation, certainly in the UK, Baiju, we everything that you need is available via the UK government carbon conversion factors for carbon quantification. Those conversion factors, you can take almost any activity and convert it into carbon dioxide equivalent using the UK government carbon conversion factors. Of course, they don't cover everything in the world, but most countries have got their own local versions of those carbon conversion factors, so you can do it that way. No worries. All right, good. I think that brings us to then. Thank you so much for attending. Happy Friday, everybody. It's nearly the weekend. We will distribute the recordings, and if anybody's got any questions that they think of after this, feel free to give me a shout. Thanks again. Bye-bye.